And I'm going to pass over to our first speaker, which is Sean. So hi, Sean.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much, Blaise, and thank you for the invite to talk at this event, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. Sounds like it's been a great week. Yeah, I'm pleased to be involved. So yeah, my formal name, I guess, is Dr. Sean Sobers. I'm a professor of cultural interdisciplinary practice at the University of the West of England. And I've got a lot of connections with Bath Spa. I'm from Bath originally, and do a lot of partnership work with Bath Spa through Fairfield House, which some of you may know, the former residence of Emperor Haile Selassie, which is in the city of Bath. So I do a lot there as well. So yeah, on this topic of can compassionate education lead the way for equality? It's an interesting question, and it's a question that is a shame we have to ask in the first place, I guess, really. We want to take it for granted that education is compassionate by nature, but we know that there's all kinds of challenges that make education spaces a battleground for a lot of the discourses within society, whether that's ideology, family values, health, gender, statistics, qualifications, future workforce, antisocial behavior, religion, all these kind of different questions and topical issues. And then everyone looks at education to kind of be sorting it out. So it becomes a very challenging space. And in the midst of all that noise and space and tension, we have to keep asking, where's the learner in the midst of those battlegrounds? Because the learners are still turning up every day for their education. We saw this with COVID as well, obviously, incredibly squeezed in these spaces. So teachers become really squeezed in educational spaces to the point where being compassionate to the people in front of them, so the learners in front of them, sometimes is all that they can do, so they don't actually feel empowered to do other things in other formal spaces where it's all about observations and stats, etc. But I would still argue that compassionate education is at the core of the heart of an idealized form of education. I take inspiration from Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian educational theorist, activist, well known for a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And in Pedagogy Oppressed, Paulo Freire talks about this notion of the teacher-student and the student-teacher, where the teacher is there learning as much and making themselves vulnerable in that space, and the student is empowered to also take on leadership roles in that space. So it's trying to flatten the power dynamic to a plateau, as Paulo Freire talks about it. It's kind of trying to work towards a critical pedagogy and a democratic form of education. And I definitely subscribe to that more participatory approach to education. I think one of the challenges is that even in those democratic education spaces, it still needs someone to have the idea in the first place, or to generate the conversation, or to raise the question. And invariably, those that feel inclined to take on those more leadership roles, even in the formal sense, start to occupy those spaces and those roles, sometimes for good, sometimes for not so good. But I think that's part of the tension of democratic educational spaces, that is it ever achievable 100%? I think that's really challenging, because people do like the shape of things and the direction of where things are going. But this idea of the curriculum from below, where the learners are directing their learning, I think is a principle to aspire to. And leading from the back, I always talk about leading from the back, where, especially when I'm doing educational workshops in creative practice, it is actually about what does the learner want to do, then I'm supporting them from the back, but they're the ones leading that direction. But there are sometimes when it is necessary to lead from the front. Sometimes learners want that direction of where to go, and they want those kind of, well, maybe do this and do that, a more clear direction. So I think as an educationalist, is to know which strategy to employ at any one moment, and it's obviously listening to the learner at every stage of the equation to understand what they're wanting from that exchange and from that interaction. So it's keeping the learner in the front of our minds. What do they want? What do they need at this particular moment in time? Sherry Arnstein's another theorist. She wrote this paper about civic participation. It's quite old, 1969, but there's a really useful model in there called the ladder of civic participation. Her name's Sherry Arnstein. And, you know, at the very bottom of the ladder, there's manipulation, and that's not what we're working towards. Then the middle's got things like tokenism, consultation, and informing. But the top 3 rows of the ladder, which she calls degrees of citizen participation, is partnership, delegated power, and citizen control. Citizen control is when the citizen, you know, they've got full control, no strings attached, and what they say is, you know, goes forward, kind of thing. Delegated power, the one below that, when, you know, there is still a facilitator, I guess, involved, but you are delegating power to the citizen, to the learner, to take on that role. And then partnership, you know, working in equal partnership and having those mutual conversations. And I would say it's those top 3 where you want to kind of be negotiating and engaging, you know, partnership, where you are having these mutual exchanges, finding out what each other's wants and, you know, what they want out of that space. Delegated power, where you are taking a step back and you are trusting the learner, but also citizen control, where they are fully in control, right? But, you know, for me, it's about strategies of when to know which education strategy to use at any one point. So I'm just going to come up to close because this is just a quick 5-minute provocation. So my final thoughts is around a word of caution, I guess, because the question asks, can compassionate education lead the way for equality? And it's that word lead that I just asked for a word of caution around. You know, education is being demanded to take the lead on so many things, as I've kind of said before, and that's from government, from media, from communities in general. But it does need the financial support and backing to take the lead, you know. So I'm not sure whether I think that educational establishments should be taking a formal lead in value-based society initiatives in a formal sense, but I do agree that absolutely educationists should be leading by example and being compassionate and putting compassion as the first principle in education and allowing that to, you know, be the value judgment that informs everything that we do. So my short answer is yes, but with a caveat that it needs support, but it should still be at the heart of it. So that's my provocation. So thank you very much. And handing over now to Penny, Dr. Penny Hay. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. That was a very formal introduction. Yes, please call me Pen. And Sean knows that I'm a big fan of Paulo Freire's work, and also Bell Hooks, actually. So very sad that she died recently. So yes, my provocation will focus on the place of compassion in education at all levels, whether that's early years or primary, secondary, further, higher, lifelong, and really hoping to shine a light on, you know, the importance of compassion in relation to social, racial and environmental justice. So inviting you together with us to reimagine the learning environment, maybe to prioritise diversity, equity, inclusion, all of those, you know, key principles that should really underpin everything. And yes, I agree with Sean that maybe compassion can co-lead, but we'll come back to that. So like Sean, I see students as co-creators, you know, whatever age, placing emphasis on co-inquiry and definitely around self-directed learning. So my PhD was in self-directed learning. I worked with the same group of children, young people, for 5 years and documented all their learning so that I could understand that. It was in the visual arts, but actually the principles apply to everything. And what I did was distill a kind of repertoire of creative pedagogical characteristics, if you like. So a creative, playful pedagogy approach to learning. So I'm a member of staff at the university. I'm an artist, an educator, a research fellow. I'm a reader in creative teaching and learning and senior lecturer in arts education. But I'm 0.5 at the university, and then the rest of the week I'm director of research for a charity that used to be called 5 by 5, but we renamed ourselves recently in memory of Ken Robinson, who was our patron for 20 years. So we're now called the House of Imagination. And I'll tell you a little bit about our projects in the few minutes I've got, and then we can come back to those. So we are with colleagues in the room, and Beck, you might want to say something about this, but we are turning our university into a social enterprise, so in service to the community, with social, creative, human, environmental, intellectual, all those values at the heart. And I think very much around the kind of green recovery, you know, the well-being economy as well. So human flourishing, compassion and well-being are absolutely central to our purpose, and everything we do is underpinned by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Well, we hope it is and will be. I think certainly a lot of colleagues in the room, you know, we are profiling the imaginative responses to the climate emergency as an absolute priority, but also with the war and the pandemic, you know, it's a real opportunity to rethink our approaches to education. UNESCO launched recently a new report, Reimagining All Our Futures Together, that I can share in the chat in a minute. And we've got various projects that kind of live these things out daily. So we've got a project with the university, colleagues, students, and our charity, Bath Cultural Education Partnership, where in the City of Imagination, as a provocation, we're looking at civic engagement and innovation and how to extend the university's civic role through creative, participatory and public engagement. So through those compassionate, creative, cultural partnerships, we're widening that participation for more people to be involved. So as Sean said, it's, you know, it's more flat level, it's almost subverting it, inverting it, rather than top-down hierarchical model. And I think that as a member of the university team, I know that students and staff, you know, we are hoping together to be a leading light and offering that invitation for negotiated spaces for creativity and imagination. And that we are future facing, you know, that we're prioritising future generations, and Wales is leading the way on that. I think it's great. I talked about that in the previous session. And as a creative learning community, whether, you know, we're in a school or a college or at our university or in a city, both young people and professionals engaged in innovative research, but to improve society, and especially the creative learning pathways of young people, not just in the arts, which is my area, but creativity is in everything. So creative connections and ongoing conversations between schools and fields, sharing cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, transcultural, all of those research and different approaches to pedagogy. As Sean says, you know, choosing the right mode, you know, to be in an improvised, responsive state when we're teaching and learning. So our charity, House of Imagination, creates spaces to make visible the power of imagination and creativity in all of our lives. And our strapline is the freedom to find and follow your fascinations. So, you know, we really prioritise agency, young people's voice, and relationships are absolutely central. So what I, as an artist, you know, those habits of mind of an artist, to be curious, be creative, imaginative, to be playful, value uncertainty, make connections, reflect, etc. They're really at the heart of a compassionate kind of education system, because they're valuing the human being and in the more than human world. I think that's really important to say. So in, you know, one example is we've redesigned our PGCE to embed the 4 C's at the heart. So creativity, critical thinking, collaboration and care. I lost the call on the word compassion, but I'll get it back. It's being filmed. So, and then just to end, another example, one of our projects is called the Forest of Imagination, which is a partnership between our charity and the university and Grant Associates. Andrew Grant is famous for designing the super trees in Singapore, the Gardens by the Bay. And that's an example of a live project for students, staff, local schools, families, and so on, to engage with a seriously playful, creative intervention in the city and the community that invites that conversation about the importance of compassion, kindness, creativity, nature, well-being, imagination in all of our lives. So a place where we can exchange ideas about, you know, what we do in a spirit of generosity, collaborating in a sustainable manner with education as an act of compassion, I would suggest, and an act of empathy. So places and spaces to imagine, to think, to make, to think through making, for people to connect, to share, and to collaborate and to prioritise emancipatory approaches, I think, that are collaborative and lean towards affirmation of hopeful actions that respond to the ecological and humanitarian crisis. So I'll shut up there now and hand over to Arti. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. Obviously, Ken Robinson has been a huge inspiration in my life as well. And I think, you know, they call the school kills creativity the sort of the gateway drug to alternative education and thinking about sort of those kind of things. And I think that's very true. Like, sort of people watch that video, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's the RSA Animate of Schools Kill Creativity by Ken Robinson. It is absolutely amazing and just changes the way people think about education and what it's for and who it's really benefiting, which is pretty much what I want to talk about today, because I really want to make the distinction between education and schools, because I think people often do conflate those. As people who are involved in higher education, you might be less likely to. I work with school-age young people, so that's the frame of reference I'm coming from, but obviously it's relevant to learning throughout our whole lives, because human beings are human beings and we learn as human beings. We don't sort of magically become different learning machines when we turn 18, so it applies completely throughout our lives. So the thing that I really struggle with is that in a system where some people must fail in order for others to succeed, how can we expect that kind of system to ever produce increasing inequality? It's really just a system for grading people according to their existing privilege. And we see that whenever you control for privilege, when looking at results, you find that the education is essentially meaningless. All it is doing is grading people according to the advantages they already had. I also believe that it's like childism is the root of all systems of oppression. And it's as children, we erroneously learn that some people have a right to control other people. It's where we learn the language of oppression. And if we do not unpick that at its root cause, everything else we try is a sticking plaster. At the same time, the mental health of young people has never been worse. There's a lot of hand-wringing about which aspect of modern society is really to blame for the declining mental health of young people. But the reality is that self-harm among young people plummets during the school holidays. That's just a fact. Like, school is, regardless of whether it's the only factor, it is definitely a significant one. And we know that mental health is strongly linked to autonomy. And why do we do this to them? I really don't understand why we're doing this when actually, it seems that the main purpose is to create a workforce for bullshit jobs that either won't exist or shouldn't exist if we want to preserve a habitable climate. Like, we can't continue with this system of capitalism that people are just working these jobs to produce more stuff that people don't need and makes people insanely unhappy. Like, we can't carry on like this. So why are we pushing children through this system that is making them very unhappy and is destroying our planet? It's just not, it doesn't make any sense at all. So I started The Garden 6 years ago. It is a self-directed and consent-based education project. And I started it because the kind of education I wanted for my children didn't exist. So I had to create it. And we've learned a lot over the years. Initially, we did call ourselves democratic. We had to stop that because we realized that we weren't democratic, we were sociocratic. And then we thought, no, we can't call ourselves that because nobody knows what that means. And it basically means that we make decisions by consensus. We technically have a vote as a backstop. We've never in 6 years had to use it. We always make decisions by consensus. I was really skeptical about whether we would be able to do that, but here we are, 6 years down the line. Consensus apparently is fine if you are a young person who isn't indoctrinated with hierarchical and adversarial thinking. What do you know? So, but that's the other reason why I wanted to do it, was I kind of wanted to know whether a different kind of culture was possible. And I knew that from my time working in policy, I knew that that was the root of it. This kind of hierarchical and adversarial culture was at the root of so many of the issues. And I just wondered whether it was an inherent human characteristic or whether a different society was possible. And so it was a bit of an experiment as well. And I think we have shown that it definitely is possible. Like, like I can see that every day in my job working with these young people. They are amazing. They are absolutely capable of making decisions without judgment and without blame and resolving conflicts, and it's amazing. They also learn so much all the time, and the depth of learning is phenomenal. And I know, Sean, that you sort of brought up this idea of like, how do you introduce ideas into the space, and who has the power to introduce those ideas into the space? And I think that's a really good point. It really hits the nail on the head. And I think one of the problems with what I do is that it is still a bit of a bubble, and it is still isolated. Ideally, learning like should always be as a part of society, shouldn't be segregated from society, which is tricky with the way we have set up our society in this atomized way. So thanks, capitalism. But I mean, yeah, you're right, it is an issue. There are ways to mitigate for it. I won't go into the intricate details of it right now, but there are ways to mitigate for it. And the internet is a huge part of that, and technology is a huge part of that. We are so lucky to live in this age where like we literally, we can find out pretty much anything we want at the touch of a button. It's right there. We don't need direct instruction to tell us the things that we need to know. It's all out there. What we need is the critical thinking skills in order to work out what is good information and what isn't such good information. That's the important stuff. So teaching the tools for learning rather than what to learn is way more important and creates lifelong learners. Oh, I've digressed from my plan, sorry. I get a bit overexcited when I'm talking about education. So I guess, like, can compassionate education lead the way to equality? I would say true equality is impossible without compassionate and consent-based education. We can't have it. Like, everything else is a sticking plaster. We can try and tweak it here and there, but ultimately I think school is unreformable. I think it is inherently, if we remove the bits that are non-consent based, it's not really school anymore. So I think ultimately the direction we have to head in is to actually have learning as a part of life again, and not have such atomized societies where like children are segregated from the rest of society, where their voices are listened to, where we actually take them seriously and what they want to do with their lives seriously. Because I'm telling you, they are like, if you do, they do incredible things. They don't just sit around playing Minecraft all the day, although sometimes they do, but not forever. And it's really like just the joy, just the absolute joy of them being able to do what they want to do with their lives. It's phenomenal. And that is the way that we're going to get to a more egalitarian society. Am I going to pass on to Stuart?
Wonderful, thank you, Artie. So for those who don't know me, my name is Stuart and I'm a disabled academic and researcher. All of my research is about inclusion of disabled people in education, particularly from higher education, but more generally than that as well. And I take a stance that compassion is absolutely essential for engaging inclusively within education. And I'll explain a little bit in my provocation today. I just want to give you some background as to who I was, because obviously I take a very disability activist stance in my understanding of compassion. And so within that, I wanted to give a very quick introduction, and I apologize to the people that have heard this before, about the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability, because this is fundamental in my perspective, in that I argue that taking a social model stance helps us understand to what extent compassion can be demonstrated in education. So the medical model of disability is the traditional model of disability, and it assumes that any disabled person, or disability rather, is something that should be viewed as wrong, as defective, something that needs to be cured or removed from society and education more generally. So that's why advocates of that would typically argue for segregated education or no education at all in certain cases. So from a medical model sense, disabled people are viewed as problems, we're seen as burdens, we're seen as objects of pity in particular. And so it's that issue around pity that I'll come to onto in a moment in relation to my understanding of compassion. So to talk about the social model then, the social model is the model that many activists take, is the more recent perspective of disability, and it argues that any challenges that disabled people experience in society and in education in particular can be attributed to existing societal inequalities that fail to account for differences in people's bodies. So for instance, access to buildings, changes in attention spans, or could be anything to do with education. And so the reason why I talk about the social model in this way is because if we think about that it's social barriers that cause disadvantage to people rather than our own bodies ourselves, it begins to make visible the challenges that we all face in education. And we begin to see that actually it's these societal barriers that impact everybody in some way. So for instance, just to give you some context, I imagine that many of us here today have experienced some form of disadvantage in education. That could be through to gender inequality, that could be due to racial inequality, that could be due to sexuality, it could be due to upbringing, it could be due to religion, it could be anything really, and any sort of fundamental part of ourselves that we view as important. And crucially, for those who were there at the disability talk yesterday that I thought was exceptional, it's a statement that many disabled people make, in that every single one of us in this room today, every single one of us will become disabled at some point if we don't already identify as disabled. So just, that's not to cause any fear or anxiety with people, it's just a point of fact that every single person in this space today will become disabled at some point in your life. And so disability, therefore, is not something that we should view as other, even though we do in education. Disability is always othered as something that needs to be separated from non-disabled people. But actually, I take a stance that disability is something that is really reflective of our common humanity. It's something that brings us all together. It's a real shared collective experience that we can all relate to. And that's exactly what the social model is saying, in that the social model provides a narrative for allowing us to unpick the societal barriers that impact every single one of us. And so if we can address what those barriers are, it can make education more inclusive and equal for everybody. So what this means for compassion, I want to argue, is that when we think about what compassion is, there can be a very fine line between lots of very similar sounding terms like pity, like empathy, like compassion. Lots of people use them fairly interchangeably, but actually they mean quite distinct things. And so the reason why I mentioned pity in this way is that I said at the start that the medical model around disability is that disabled people become objects of pity, objects that need to be seen as wrong or defective and cured, segregated, etc. And so if we want to show compassion according to a medical model sense, I stress that that's not really compassion at all, because actually you can't really demonstrate compassion to another person if you're already viewing them as defective, as objects of pity, as objects that need to be cured. And so rather than showing compassion, it's actually seeking to reinforce these existing power inequalities that we all find ourselves in. And more completely, it acts to further the othering that I've just spoken about. And so going back to my point that everybody will become disabled at some point, I want to take a point that if everybody's going to be disabled at some point, nobody wants to be pitied, nobody wants to be seen as an object of a burden, nobody wants to be seen as a problem. And actually, if we view disability as something that affects our collective humanity, we can begin to see that actually the only way that we can show compassion in education is by taking a social model stance. Because really, I want to argue that compassion can only truly be possible when people recognize that we're not disadvantaged by who we are and our bodies and our lived experience, but rather the social barriers around us that impact every single one of us. So I think at that point, I will probably leave it there and open up the panel for the rest of the discussion. But thank you everybody for listening, and thank you to the previous three speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for all your kind of unique perspectives and takes on the topic. Does anyone have any kind of initial questions or comments? Someone's just sent me a question actually, but yeah, does anyone have any initial kind of responses to things that have been said? So the question that I've just been sent is, a question for the whole panel. What should we do as educators about a curriculum that isn't compassionate?
You go first, Artie.
Thanks, Penny. Burn it. It's just, I have this, why there are so many teachers. I really do think they cannot stop us all. We have to take a stand and say, this is harming young people and it's not good enough. They deserve so much better. And to speak to what Stuart was saying, like, it is disabling them. How many children do we have to pathologize and give a diagnosis where actually they, in a world that wasn't so oppressive to them, they wouldn't need those diagnoses, which is not to say I disagree with the diagnoses, because I don't, but they're very useful. However, they are being disabled by the system that they are in. They are being made not able to function by the system that they're in. So I say we have to have teachers taking a stand and saying, I am not going to do this anymore.
Shall I come in there? Or actually, Marianne, you wanted to say something. Go on.
Right. Firstly, hallelujah. Every single person who has spoken today, this is exactly what I hoped for from coming to university. If I could cry, I would, with joy. That's the first thing. Everything that each person has spoken about today, I have been able to personally relate to. It's like somebody has just flung my whole life experience and current experiences in a big box and said, there, that's it. That's what, your life is. I'm currently doing creative arts practice. I've looked at, I didn't know Ken Robinson had died, because that talk is just amazing. It blew me away. I'm a late person. I'm a person who was diagnosed with autism, furthermore Asperger's, at the age of 52. And in November 21, I was diagnosed also with ADHD. And the person that diagnosed that, she said, you'll not be surprised to know that, yes, you have ADHD, and it's as obvious as your Asperger's. When I was told I had Asperger's, my response was, you're correct. Yeah. Now, the thing is, I went through 54 years as somebody that was dysfunctional, mentally ill, depressed. Have you ever seen that film, Lucy, where it's got Morgan Freeman in it, and she ingests a drug accidentally, and then her brain is expanding and expanding, and she becomes this other being? What is happening to me right now is a bit low level Lucy. Somebody, when I was reading up about one of your, I'm not going to take it over, I'm sorry, I'll shut up in a minute, honestly. It's very, very exciting to be in this room. Somebody who I've read up about was talking about reductionist and systematic, yes, Artemis, yes. I was thinking about that, how I operate, and that systematic, that connections, making those connections, that is exactly it. I think systematic thinking can have an effect of reductionist if you're not careful, but making those links and pulling things together, And I suppose my only, and I'm going through it at the moment, everything you are talking about with regards to compassion in education is, I find myself frequently having to use this idea of disability, yeah, as a self-imposed victiming of myself, yeah. And what is actually happening really is I am continually having to set my own agenda and recalibrate the system, yeah. And I am very appreciative of having some exceptionally compassionate, if that's the word. But no, it isn't. I am very relieved that I work with humans who see me as a human, as opposed to somebody with a disability. All I want to say is, I want to speak to people more in some way at some point. I'm going to shut up now.
That's very powerful, Marianne. I'm glad you had the mic. It's very moving and very powerful. And I know that we all want to respond to you. And so I'll just quickly respond to you and to the previous question around the curriculum and teachers and so on, because I think Artie said burn it. And absolutely, one of the very first projects I did when I used to be a teacher, so I've known Sean for a long time, and we've also worked together at UWE, which was absolutely delightful. But I specialised in young people who were disaffected and disengaged, and re-engaged them through the arts. And interestingly, when I was a teacher, when the national curriculum came in, I recycled all the documents of the national curriculum and made them into sketchbooks for my children. And I think as a kind of political statement, I didn't actually get into trouble, but I think it was, you know, an absolute moment of I do not agree with a national curriculum that is a deficit model of education where you're filling children up with facts. You're dissolving that sense of intrinsic motivation. You know, we want children to get up in the morning and want to learn and be curious and so on. And so I think that, you know, fast forward to now, what we're doing with quite a few of us who are activists, creative activists, artists, disabled activists, you know, I'm working with Stuart, I think it's really important that we're opening up these spaces for liberated learning. And so recently given two presentations in the House of Commons about how we need to do things differently. We need a different kind of education system that has compassion and creativity in everything, and the arts, you know, we need to save the arts. But anyway, I could get on a hobby horse, but I'm not going to. I'm going to hand over to whichever order, Sean, and then you pass over to Artie or Stuart.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I mean, it's what these sessions are all about, because when it gets to this stage, I just want to listen and not actually speak. You know what I mean? And for me, that's also part of it. You know, I'm up here as the so-called expert. I'm no expert at all. You know what I mean? We're all learning in this space and trying to find the solutions through. I think it's a really pertinent question about what to do with the curriculum. You know, because I think I guess it depends on context. You know what I mean? If you're a full-time teacher and you're reliant on your day job and all that, you know, how do you negotiate that space when you've got all those kind of tensions involved? And you know what, I don't know who said it, but there's someone who said education's too important to leave to schools or to the education system. Do you know what I mean? And I think that, you know, when it comes to questions around, like, you know, I do a lot of stuff around Black history and these kind of things. And actually, absolutely, there needs to be more diversity in schools, needs to be more Black history in schools. But also as a parent, I think it's too important to leave Black history just to schools. Do you know what I mean? So we have these kind of tensions, really. Because for me as an educator, I've got the privilege, I guess, working in higher education, which is in a way a bit less scrutinized than in primary and secondary. But I think as teachers, as educators, you know, we can do things to your integrity and to your principles and do it in the way that enable you to sleep at night, you know what I mean? So if there's a curriculum that you know is inherently sexist, bigoted, homophobic, racist, whatever, then are you just gonna be, you know, delivering that message by rote, or are you actually going to be trying to communicate it in a different way that you're not delivering those messages that are coming through? And but it is really challenging depending on situation. But you know, I'm definitely an advocate of the deschooling. You know, and Armistice is reminding me of that. My PhD, similar to Penny, was looking at all those different things. I mean, I think the thing about there's a question in here about homeschooling, which I think is relevant and related to this as well, because I think with these initiatives, with these things, is like just communicate. Don't try and do them alone. You know, if you want to home educate, and I respect any parent that wants to home educate, but don't try and do it alone. There's other home educators. There's networks of and organizations that can support. So I think it's a huge responsibility. And this is where, you know, in terms of this whole Palo Freire thing, I have to hold up my hands to say I'm a hypocrite, because all my children, my two children have gone to the school system. I haven't home educated them. Do you know what I mean? So we have to think about those pinch points as well. But absolutely, you know, share, talk, it's a big commitment. You know, when the COVID thing started to hit, you know, the very first lockdown, when all the children were sent home, and there was all this scramble around, you know, home educating, you know, my first response was actually just let them de-school. Do you know what I mean? They're coming home. Actually, now's the time to get detox education out of their system, if you like, and find a different way of learning and different way of being. But the contradiction of that is when they go back into the school, they've got to then hit targets, and you know, you don't want to set them up to fail. As Armistice rightly said, these spaces which are mechanisms to grade, you know, so it is a challenging one. So all I can say is absolutely, thanks Armistice for putting that in the chat. Share, talk, listen, and don't try and do those things alone, because it is a huge responsibility. But I completely take my hat off to anyone who goes and does that home education.
I don't know if anyone else wants to come in there, but there are a couple of questions that we've had in the chat. So the first one was that one around home schooling. So what do you suggest that individual home educators can do that is best for their own often system damaged children, whilst also protecting the infringed right to home educate, whilst also co-creating compassionate education? So there's lots of different bits in there, but yeah, Artie.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it's been tough, right? Like technically my kids are home educated, which has been very hard for it's been to court. I lost, I went to the PGCE, got them out again. So it's all fine now, but it was tough. And the problem is that there are a lot of pressures on home educators, despite the fact that home educators home educated young people repeatedly do better, not only academically, but also socially when they measure such things. And yet we are consistently under pressure of like, oh, are you doing a good enough job? Are you sure you're really qualified to do this? And it's nonsense when you actually look at the mess of the school system and how they're failing school children, when 35% of primary school children leave not meeting the expected standards. They're not even by their own measures, which I think are nonsense anyway. They're not even meeting their own standards. So they're failing by their own measures. And yet the focus is on home educators and how dangerous home educators are, despite the fact that evidently not. Like, home educated young people are far less likely to be failed academically or neglected or abused than school children, and yet the focus is still on home educated. Right, sorry, soapbox. So I'm going to try and what you can actually do. So I'm personally working on this at the moment. I work for a charity called Phoenix Education Trust, and we run a program called Freedom to Learn. And what we're really hoping to do is bring together everybody who's interested in rights respecting education, whether that be home educators or democratic schools, mainstream teachers, anybody who's interested in making the education system and all of education more rights respecting, academics as well, try and bring everyone together. So we are, like Sean said, we are a movement, we have a strong collective voice, and that's the only way I think we're really going to put any have any lasting and effective change is if we can have this strong collective voice. So I put the link to the Freedom to Learn Facebook group there. I'm going to say the website's a little bit of a mess at the moment. Sorry about that. I'm trying to sort it out. But basically, I would really love to kind of get everybody together to kind of go, actually, we need to demand that something be different. I know Bruno asked a question as well, which is linked to this too, because I know Bruno is setting up a network of mainstream teachers. And that's sort of going to be part of this network as well. Your question, Bruno, was, so I'm going to try and scroll back where it's, what do the panelists think we can do with teachers and families that are still forced to be in conventional settings, while stepping out of the system is a valid option, might not be accessible for all? Yeah, which is absolutely massive. And I'm going to stop talking now and let someone else maybe take on that question.
Stuart, I've got a response, but you go first, Stuart.
Okay, well, it was. I don't really have an answer. You know, I wish I did, but I think it's something that I always say to any teachers, any parents in the room, that regardless of where children are being educated, the key thing that we don't often remember is sort of the woolly external learning that typically comes from sort of stereotyped marginalized identities. So for instance, for many parents themselves don't identify as disabled, and teachers probably won't identify as disabled as well. We have all, based on the sort of systems that we all grew up in, have been exposed to a very ableist environment where disability is not something to be valued, and so the collective humanity of people isn't encouraged either. So I always try and encourage, however possible, wherever the student is, for the teacher, the parent, to recognize that actually a child is not failing necessarily, they are failing or struggling in a system that won't support them. So actually, if there's a way that we can try and encourage the children not to lose their own sense of self-efficacy and self-esteem and hope that actually they are better than the system says they are. For instance, in my own experience, although I've got a PhD now, I really, really struggled through school. Everybody told me that I was going to be a difficult student to get through because of all the additional needs I would have. Something in me said, I'm better than this. And I maintain that is what got me through. So I think above all, parents need to try and encourage that fire, whatever that fire is in children.
Oh, that's so beautiful, Stuart. That's why I love working with you. But honestly, I mean, I know this is being filmed, so I have to be careful, but I also was a disaffected student. I used to get to the school gate, I think Sean knows this, I used to get to the school gate and turn around and go and draw in the park. And it was my art teacher that saved me and pulled me into the studio, into the art room on a metaphorical thread. And we used to share Marmite sandwiches together. I mean, you probably couldn't do that these days with safeguarding and everything. And then he stayed my mentor until he died. And he was the reason I studied art, and he was the reason, like you, I've now got a PhD, which was unheard of in my kind of thinking about my own self-worth. So yes, I do think it is about, for me, it's what I said earlier, it's about that intrinsic motivation. There's a beautiful, beautiful quote from Reggio Emilia in Italy that's really inspired our practice with our charity. And I probably won't get it right, like I got the Philip Pullman wrong, but don't tell him. But it's something like, if children, young people, if they see themselves as artists, as authors, as inventors, then their motivations and interests explode. I had a child who came into my care, he was about 10 or 11, and he didn't feel as though he fitted into the school system. And I just said, literally, what would you like to do? What's your interests? What's your ideas? Who do you want to work with? How do you want to share ideas? And he said, I just like making films. And I said, well, make animations then, make films, do it across the whole curriculum. He's just won a BAFTA, and I have to be careful because of GDPR, but he's also been nominated for an Oscar. So it is possible for everyone. My new book, by the way, is not a plug. It's called Children Are Artists for exactly that reason, to find our own identity and our interests. I mean, Ken Robinson first book was, you know, finding your element, or one of his first books, you know, find that passion in you, like Stuart says. And just quickly, and then I'll pass back to others. Ken's new book is out. Ken died, and his daughter Kate, who is our patron now, we've worked closely with her. I've known her all her life. In fact, it's the year I met Ken, she was born. And she finished Ken's manifesto, and Ken says, be the change. You know, we are the system. His other book, which is somewhere here, you can tell I've been teaching because everything's around everywhere. And probably tease me that I haven't tied it up, but you know, his book Creative Schools, he launched at Glasgow University in 2017, something like that. He maybe the year before, you know, it's called The Grassroots Revolution That's Transforming Education. So to your question, Bruno, you know, he says rock and roll wasn't a government-led initiative. Revolutions don't wait for legislation. They emerge from what people do at the ground level. The lesson we most need to learn is that there is more to life on earth than human beings, and more to being human than self-interest. Our futures all depend on learning this lesson by heart. So that's where compassion comes in, I think, really strongly. I'm going to hand the baton to someone else.
Are these closing thoughts now, I guess, or?
Go for it, Sean.
Yeah, I just remembered a memory that sprung to mind that kind of said all it needed to say to me at the time, and still now, about the difference. And as Armitage said, you know, schools aren't the totality of education, kind of thing. I used, in 1996, I used to run an after-school media club for young people, 13 to 16-year-old, and two of the boys in that group were from the same school in the same year. And I was doing another project with the school, and I happened to meet their teacher, and they said, you know, gosh, you've got such and such and such and such, you know, they must be a nightmare. They must be a handful in your club. And I was like, they're two of the best young people in the group. They're two of the most productive, hardworking, creative, imaginative. But in school, they can, you know, they're bouncing off the wall. They're too individual or whatever was going on. When they came to the after school, well, it wasn't an after school club, so it wasn't at school, it was somewhere else completely separate, the location. But when they came to my space, they were completely different. I would have never known that these were identified as problem children in a school setting. And to me, that said everything it needed to say about how schools squash individualism, creativity, people that question stuff, people, you know, young people that are intelligent. And this isn't me being down on teachers, because I know it's an incredibly difficult job. And I think the tipping point with conversations like this, that it can sound like we're being down on teachers, but it's not at all, because teachers are also being squashed in that same system and having creativity drained. So I think it's a hugely difficult thing. But for me, it's about creating space, is creating an open space where young people can be themselves. They are allowed to question. They are allowed to say, hang on a minute, does this make sense? And, you know, for those questions and conversations to run through, really. So it comes back to student-teacher, teacher-student, making oneself vulnerable and trying to be both humans in that space without being a law dictator, I guess. So but thank you. It's been really great conversation. I've loved listening to all of it, so thank
you. Yeah, it's Artie and Stuart, is there anything that you kind of want to share before we kind of officially wrap up?
I was just going to say there wasn't anything really from me. I just wanted to say thank you everybody again for all the really interesting comments and yeah, the panel. But yeah, I'll pass back to Artie if she wants to say something.
Yeah, I totally want to say something. I really do think, I think we're fighting for the soul of humanity here. There are some people who believe that people need to be controlled in order to be good humans. And I am not one of those people. I think that human beings do not need to be controlled in order to be good people. If you treat people with respect, they will live up to that. And you see that with children all the time. And I just want to encourage everybody here, and I'm sure you already do this, is not just to treat children like human beings, but to think of them as full human beings all the time, full time. And if there's a way in which you speak to a child where you think to yourself, I wouldn't speak to an adult like that, maybe that's a time to like check yourself and go, actually, I am perpetuating childism, which is then having this massive knock-on effect and like creating all systems of oppression. So that's the weight that we all have on our shoulders when we speak to children. And I'd like you all to remember that. No pressure.
Thanks. As a big and inspiring kind of statement to close us with. Thank you everyone so much for coming.